People in Boston are putting a spotlight these days on the need for affordable housing and on budget pressures on the Boston Public Schools. Our guest has also been tracking these topics, most recently with a look at a possible new source of revenue for housing preservation and open space. We'd like to welcome the president of the Boston Municipal Research Bureau, Sam Tyler. Thank you very much for being with us, Sam.
Thanks, Chris.
Talk about this possible 1% tax surcharge and how it would be used and how much it could do for affordable housing.
Well, this is the Community Preservation Act, which has been accepted by 160 communities in Massachusetts. It basically would provide a 1% surcharge. There was an amendment in 2012 trying to make it more attractive to cities, because otherwise it would be like 2 or 3%. So it's 1%, but it would provide dollars both from the city from this surcharge, but also some matching funds, which last year was about 30% of what the cities and towns raised. And it can be used for 3 purposes: affordable housing, community resources, or open space, and now with the amendments, maintenance of open space and playgrounds and parks. So that also makes it attractive. It is a 1% surcharge, so it's basically what that means is it adds a 1% to everybody's tax bill. For homeowners, there's a $100,000 value exemption that will mitigate that cost. For business, there's the same $100,000 that won't make that much of a difference. But it also comes in the context of, that the city is depending on the property tax, they are shifting a large share of that to the business community, business property, so that if you only had a single tax rate, about over $500 million of tax burden would shift from business to residential. So it's very attractive in terms of additional dollars that could be made available for those 3 needs, and certainly in Boston with affordable housing, park maintenance, there's enough historic resources, there would be good use of it. And mainly for communities, but we see this more in the residential communities, it's really quality of life. And that would be the same, I think, for Boston, that it would make for a better quality of life, that there would be more resources for those 3 purposes, can only be used for those 3 purposes. And there's a separate committee that would be established to make those recommendations. So it would be outside of the normal appropriating process. And interestingly enough, in the very beginning of the process, which we're just starting to see now, there will be eventually, maybe in March sometime, a hearing on this issue. But it's the city council that really takes the lead role in the beginning, both in terms of deciding to put it on the ballot if they choose to do that, later on what the committee structure would be. There are 5 positions that are established in the law. Somebody representing the Housing Authority, somebody representing Parks Commission, Planning Department, and then there's a possibility for 4 others, so community people could be added to that committee. But it has to go through a big gauntlet. This is the second time that this has come before the city. In 2001, it also was put on the ballot, and it lost something like 57 to 43%. There was a sort of concern that the economy was heading into a recession at the time, so that didn't help. And there were some businesses that funded a media campaign against it. You don't hear that much right now about this, but it's still at the very early stages. All that's been done so far is that it's been introduced to the City Council and sent to the Government Operations Committee that's chaired by Councilor Michael Flaherty. And until, I guess, the next step would be a hearing. But again, that won't be rushed.
Well, there are many people who can afford to own property in Boston who can absorb the surcharge, but there are some people, maybe they've owned property for a long time when it didn't cost so much, and maybe their income isn't that great now. Shouldn't they be worried about absorbing the surcharge?
Well, there is the 100,000 exemption, and I think actually for those who are less well off, there's a 100% exemption that could apply. But it is another tax, and it's also a bigger tax, frankly, for businesses that are already paying more, because of classification. But homeowners in Boston, actually, they may not think that, but they do well. I mean, the classification shifts over something like, or takes off their burden, about $2,100, and then there's a 30% residential exemption that's another $1,900. So for homeowners, I mean, if you have to own and live in the house, it's like $4,100 taken off your tax bill. So if you were to compare Boston average single-family tax bill with 20 other surrounding communities, Boston has the second lowest average single-family tax bill.
Turning to the schools, we've already heard about the budget gap. The figures are anything from 10 million to 50 million. How do you see this shaping up?
Well, first of all, there is no budget gap. I mean, there's no budget deficit. The numbers right now show basically that the school department would get a $13.5 million increase in its budget. That does not include collective bargaining increases because all the contracts will expire in June or August. And it's a $1 billion budget. I think the issue is, yes, they're going to have to absorb, they're going to have to find ways to be more efficient. But I think that there's a deeper problem with the school budget. Certainly the facility issue is one. I mean, there's a study underway, which will take another year, looking at a 10-year master facilities plan. But the problem is that Boston has huge excess capacity in seats, and it's costing the city. So that it's basically dollars that are being spread thin because we have so many schools. Now, that's not to say there's going to be a huge number of schools that will be recommended for closing, but I mean, this plan, when it's done, will recommend school closings, may recommend building of new schools in certain parts of the city where there's more students. But this should be manageable. I mean, the school department has ended every year with an operating surplus for at least 20 years. When we're talking about schools, some schools that are feeling cuts, sometimes that's because there's a reduction in their enrollment. And based on the way in which the city or the school department funds its schools, it's based on the students that go to those schools.
We have a little time. One other big challenge here is there's going to be a decision by the city council about the arbitration settlement for a new contract for Boston police detectives. It's a big figure, but what do you think?
I think there's a real concern that we have in these arbitration awards, which seem to build on each other and it escalates and gets to a point where they're just not going to be, supportable. There was a firefighter's contract that was an arbitration award, and then a couple years later, a year later, there was a patrolman's association arbitration award that increased because they wanted to be on parity with the firefighters. And now the detectives have gone to arbitration, and they're increasing because the arbiter says, well, they should be sort of in line with what the patrolman got. And so it's arbitration award that leads to more salary increase, another arbitration award that tries to bring people up to parity. I frankly think this is a difficult issue. It may not be for the city council, but it's one they should take seriously, because these contracts and the salaries and the overall cost, because it does impact on overtime and everything like that, are getting so expensive that we're seeing over time an impact on other city departments. That, over the last 5 years, the school department spending has increased by 25%. For police and fire combined, it's increased by over 18%. But for all the other city departments, and some of these are small little departments, but it's also parks and public works and library, overall over that same period, their increase is about 13%. So that's how we're seeing how the city's paying for this, is that it's not able to provide the resources to other departments because of these higher salaries. And frankly, with all the collective bargaining contracts expired, except for the firefighters, which will be next year, this arbitration award will influence the salaries that will be negotiated, or there will be arbitration again for the public safety contracts. And I think also certainly for the teachers who will be looking for more. I mean, this has got to stop. This arbitration is for public safety is exceeding what the city is going to be able to pay.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
From the Boston Municipal Research Bureau, Sam Tyler. In a moment, a Black History lesson on Black teachers.